We all know what it feels like when life strips everything away, leaving us hollow and guarded against further pain. When grief builds walls so high that even kindness struggles to find a way in. Duke William Ashford understood this better than most, as he stood in his stone manor during the brutal summer of 1867, watching 120-degree-house heat turn his land into cracked desert. For 3 years, since his wife's death, he had lived carefully, keeping everyone at arm's length. The townspeople respected him, but whispered that sorrow had made him cold. Then one afternoon, through the shimmering heat, a desperate mare appeared at his gates with 2 stumbling foals. Without hesitation, she led them straight through his open front door and collapsed on his cool stone floor. The Duke stared in amazement at this mother's fierce determination to save her children. But will this unexpected act of trust be enough to crack open a heart he thought was permanently closed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun rose like a merciless forge over the western frontier, promising another day of punishment for anything foolish enough to be alive in such conditions. Duke William Ashford stood at the tall windows of his stone manor, watching the heat shimmer rise from earth so parched it had forgotten what water looked like. The thermometer outside his study already read 95 degrees, and it was barely past 7 in the morning. His hand unconsciously moved to the thin gold chain around his neck, where Margaret's wedding ring rested against his chest, a habit he'd developed in the 3 years since her passing. The weight of it had become both comfort and torment, a constant reminder of what he'd lost and his stubborn refusal to let it go. "Your Grace," came the gentle voice of Mrs. Henderson from behind him. The housekeeper had served the manor for nearly 15 years, weathering both the joy of his marriage to Margaret and the long, cold aftermath of her death. "Breakfast is ready, sir." William didn't turn from the window. Beyond the cracked earth of what had once been Margaret's garden, he could see Thomas, his groundskeeper, attempting to coax life from the stubborn soil. The man was nearing 60, his weathered hands moving with the patience of someone who understood that some battles took longer than others. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'll take it in the study again." She hesitated at the doorway. "Sir, if I may, Dr. Collins mentioned he might call today. Perhaps you could receive him in the drawing room. The morning light there is quite pleasant, and the study will be fine." His voice carried the quiet authority that had made him respected throughout the territory. But Mrs. Henderson had known him long enough to hear the weariness beneath it. The Ashford estate sprawled across 2,000 acres of what had been prime grazing land before the drought began. William's great-uncle had chosen this location well, high enough to catch the mountain breezes, with natural springs that had run clear and cold for generations. Now those springs barely managed a trickle, and the breezes carried nothing but more heat. William's daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. He would rise before dawn, dress in the same careful manner his military training had ingrained in him, and spend the morning hours reviewing accounts and correspondence in his study. The afternoon was reserved for inspecting the grounds with Thomas, checking on their dwindling livestock, and making the hard decisions about which fields to abandon to the drought. Evenings were for solitude, sitting in Margaret's favorite chair by the fireplace, a book in his lap that he rarely read, listening to the house settle around him like a living thing sighing in its sleep. But it hadn't always been this way. When he'd first brought Margaret here as his bride 4 years ago, the manor had thrummed with life and possibility. She transformed the austere stone walls with her laughter, filled the rooms with flowers from her garden, and drawn out a warmth in William that he'd forgotten he possessed. They'd made plans, for children, for expanding the estate, for growing old together watching grandchildren play in these same rooms. Margaret had possessed an almost supernatural ability to coax life from unwilling ground. Her garden had been legendary throughout the territory, an emerald oasis that seemed to mock the harsh realities of frontier living. She'd kept detailed journals of every plant, every success and failure, writing in her careful script about the mysteries of growth and renewal. Plants are like people, she'd once told him, kneeling in the rich soil with her hands dark with earth. They need the right conditions to flourish, but they also need someone to believe in their potential. William had believed in her potential, and she in his. Together, they'd been formidable, his practical engineering mind complementing her intuitive understanding of living things. He'd designed an irrigation system that maximized their precious water, while she'd chosen crops and flowers that could thrive in the harsh climate. Then the fever had come. It had started as nothing, a slight headache, a touch of fatigue that she'd attributed to working too long in the sun. By the time Dr. Collins had been summoned, the sickness had taken hold with a viciousness that still haunted William's dreams. 3 days. That's all it had taken to strip away everything they'd built together. The funeral had drawn mourners from 3 counties. Margaret had been beloved not just for her beauty or her station, but for her genuine kindness. She'd treated the ranch hand's children with the same gentle attention she'd given her prize roses, and her death had left a void that seemed to extend far beyond the boundaries of the estate. In the months that followed, William had thrown himself into the practical matters of grief, settling her affairs, donating her clothes to the church, closing off the rooms that held too many memories. But he'd kept her garden journal, unable to part with the evidence of her dreams. Now, as he sat at his heavy oak desk, with his untouched breakfast growing cold beside him, William opened that journal to a random page. Her handwriting seemed to dance across the yellowed paper. The desert willow is stronger than it appears. What looks like delicate beauty is actually fierce determination. It blooms when everything else has given up. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become the opposite of Margaret's desert willow, apparently strong but actually brittle, surviving rather than thriving. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Your Grace?" Thomas stepped into the study, his hat in his weathered hands. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, but we've lost another section of the north pasture. The ground's cracked so deep you could lose a boot in it." William nodded, closing the journal. "How many head will we need to move?" "The last dozen steers, and maybe the horses if this keeps up, though I'm not sure where we'd put them. The south pasture's not much better." They spent the next hour discussing practical matters, which wells still produced water, whether it was worth trying to save the last of the kitchen garden, how long their feed stores might last. It was easier to focus on logistics than emotions, on problems that had solutions rather than losses that couldn't be undone. By noon, the temperature had climbed past 110 degrees. William walked the grounds with Thomas, their boots crunching on soil that looked more like broken pottery than earth. The few remaining cattle clustered in whatever shade they could find, their flanks heaving with the effort of simply breathing. "Never seen anything like it," Thomas said, squinting at the cloudless sky. "My granddaddy talked about dry spells, but this," he shook his head, "this feels like the land itself is giving up." They paused at the remains of Margaret's garden, where a few hardy desert plants struggled to survive among the dried remnants of more ambitious plantings. William reached down to touch a withered rose bush, remembering Margaret's hands carefully tending these same branches. "She wouldn't have given up," he said quietly. Thomas looked at him with understanding. The older man had been with the estate since before William's marriage, had watched his employer transform from a reserved but pleasant young duke into someone who held the world at arm's length. "No, sir, she wouldn't have. But she also wouldn't have expected you to tend the garden alone forever." The comment hung in the air between them like the shimmering heat, unspoken truths made visible. William straightened, brushing the dust from his hands. "We should check the eastern boundary before it gets any hotter." They walked in companionable silence, 2 men who understood that some conversations were best left unfinished. The eastern boundary marked the edge of William's property and the beginning of true wilderness, miles of desert that stretched toward the distant mountains like a sea of stone and stubborn vegetation. It was here as they stood in the shade of a lone cottonwood that had somehow survived the drought, that William made a decision that would change everything. "Thomas," he said, "tomorrow I want you to open all the gates." The groundskeeper frowned. "Sir, any animal desperate enough to make it this far deserves whatever help we can offer. Water, shade, whatever we have." Thomas nodded slowly. "You thinking of the wild horses that come through sometimes? The mustangs? I'm thinking of anything that needs refuge." As they walked back toward the manor, William felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained for 3 long years. Margaret's journal was right about the desert willow. Sometimes what looked like surrender was actually preparation for a different kind of strength. He just didn't know that tomorrow. That strength would be tested by a desperate mother and her children, arriving in a way that would make him question everything he thought he understood about courage, trust, and the possibility of beginning again. The heat struck like a physical blow the moment William stepped outside the next afternoon. Even with the stone walls of the manor providing some insulation, the temperature inside had climbed to nearly 90 degrees. Outside, the air shimmered with such intensity that the distant mountains seemed to dance like mirages. William had spent the morning in his study, wrestling with ledgers that told the same grim story, no matter how many times he reviewed them. The drought was bleeding his resources dry faster than he'd anticipated. Thomas had already moved the last of the cattle to whatever shade could be found, and even the hardiest plants in Margaret's former garden were beginning to surrender to the relentless sun. He was reaching for his hat when Mrs. Henderson appeared in the hallway, her face flushed from the heat of the kitchen. "Your Grace, I've opened every window in the house, but it's not helping much. Perhaps you should postpone your afternoon inspection until evening?" William considered this. The sensible thing would be to wait until sunset, when the temperature might drop to a merely unbearable level. But the water troughs needed checking, and the animals couldn't wait for convenience. "I'll make it quick," he said, settling the wide-brimmed hat on his head. "Keep the main doors open for air circulation." The great front doors of the manor were massive oak affairs that William's great-uncle had imported from back east, hung on iron hinges that had been forged by the finest craftsmen of their day. They stood nearly 8 feet tall and opened wide enough for a carriage to pass through, a grand gesture that had seemed appropriate for the ambitions of a man building an empire in the wilderness. Today, those doors stood wide open, creating a cross-breeze that provided the house's only relief from the stifling heat. William had been walking the property for perhaps 20 minutes when he noticed the dust cloud on the eastern horizon. At first, he assumed it was Thomas returning from checking the boundary fences. But as the cloud drew closer, he realized it was moving with an urgency that suggested something beyond routine ranch work. The dust was being kicked up by hooves. He realized, multiple sets of them moving fast across the hardpan desert floor. William shaded his eyes with his hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing through the heat distortion. 3 shapes emerged from the shimmer, moving with the desperate, stumbling gait of creatures pushed beyond endurance. As they drew closer, William's breath caught in his throat. A mare, dark with sweat and exhaustion, was leading 2 foals across his property with single-minded determination, but she wasn't heading for the water troughs or the shade of the barn. She was making a direct line for the open front doors of the manor house. William found himself walking quickly back toward the house, then breaking into a run as he realized what was happening. The mare had fixed on those open doors like a beacon of salvation, and nothing was going to deter her from reaching them. He reached the front steps just as the mare arrived at the threshold. For a moment she paused, her sides heaving with exhaustion, foam flecking her muzzle. Her eyes, large and dark with desperation, met his, and William felt something pass between them that he couldn't quite name. It was as if she was asking permission, or perhaps offering explanation for what she was about to do. Then, without hesitation, she stepped across the threshold into the cool shadows of the great hall. The foals followed their mother with the unquestioning trust of the very young, their small hooves clicking against the polished stone floor. The mare made it perhaps 10 feet into the house before her legs gave out. and she collapsed onto the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire manor. William stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. In 32 years of life, in all his travels and experiences, he had never seen anything like this. A wild horse, a mother protecting her young, had somehow recognized his home as sanctuary and claimed it with a courage that took his breath away. "Mrs. Henderson," he called, his voice carrying through the house with an urgency that brought the housekeeper running. She appeared at the top of the main staircase, looked down at the scene below, and stopped dead. "Sweet Lord in heaven," she whispered. The mare lay on her side, her breathing labored but steady. The foals had pressed close against her, their small bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. One was a dark bay like its mother, the other a lighter chestnut with white markings that seemed to glow in the dim light of the hall. "Thomas!" William shouted toward the open doors. "Thomas, get in here!" The groundskeeper appeared within moments, drawn by the urgency in his employer's voice. When he saw the horses, his weathered face broke into an expression of wonder. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "In 40 years of working with animals, I've never seen the like." William knelt beside the mare, careful to move slowly so as not to startle her. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her coat dark with sweat that spoke of miles traveled under the punishing sun. But her eyes were alert, watching him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "She's dehydrated," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "Mrs. Henderson, we need cool water, not cold. It might shock her system. And cloths, as many as you can find. Right away." "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, gathering her skirts and hurrying toward the kitchen. Thomas was already moving toward the foals, his hands gentle as he examined them. "They're in better shape than Mama," he reported. "Young ones handle heat better sometimes, but they'll need water and rest." William found himself speaking to the mare in the same soft tone he'd once used with Margaret when she was ill. "Easy, girl. You're safe now. You brought your babies to the right place." The mare's ear flicked toward his voice, and something in her posture seemed to relax slightly. William reached out slowly, letting her see his hand before gently touching her neck. Her skin was hot and dry, but she didn't flinch from his touch. Mrs. Henderson returned with a basin of tepid water and an armload of clean cloths. "I've sent young Peter to town for Dr. Collins," she said. "I know he treats animals as well as people." William nodded, beginning to sponge the mare's neck and shoulders with the damp cloths. The water seemed to revive her somewhat, and she lifted her head to look at him more directly. "What made you come here?" he asked quietly. "How did you know?" Thomas had coaxed the foals to drink from a shallow pan of water, their small muzzles dipping gratefully into the liquid. "She must have been traveling for hours," he said. "Maybe days. Takes something powerful to drive a mother this far with little ones." As the mare began to cool, William found himself studying her more closely. She was no Mustang. Her conformation and bearing spoke of good breeding, possibly cavalry stock or ranch horses that had gone wild. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her thick mane, he could make out the worn remnants of a leather halter. "She belonged to someone once," he said, fingering the weathered leather. "This didn't come off by accident. The halter was old and cracked by sun and weather, but it had been well made originally. Someone had cared for this mare, had taken the time to fit her properly with good leather. The fact that she still wore it suggested she'd been lost or abandoned rather than born wild." Dr. Collins arrived within the hour, his medical bag in one hand and a look of amazement on his face as he took in the scene. "In 20 years of practice," he said, shaking his head, "I've delivered babies in blizzards, treated gunshot wounds by candlelight, and pulled more splinters than I care to count. But I've never made a house call to treat horses in a duke's front hall." The examination was thorough, but gentle. Dr. Collins pronounced the mare severely dehydrated, but otherwise sound, and the foals tired but healthy. "They'll need rest and plenty of water," he said, closing his bag. "But they should recover fully." As the afternoon wore on, William found himself reluctant to leave the great hall. The mare had managed to stand and was now drinking steadily from a larger bucket Thomas had brought. The foals stayed close to her side, their earlier panic replaced by the natural curiosity of the young. "We should move them to the barn," Thomas suggested. "More appropriate and cooler once the sun goes down." William considered this. The practical part of his mind agreed. Animals belonged in barns, not drawing rooms. But something deeper, something he couldn't quite name, rebelled against the idea. "No," he said finally. "They came here for a reason. This is where they felt safe." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two men. "I'll bring feed and more water then. Make them comfortable." As evening approached and the temperature finally began its slow descent from unbearable to merely oppressive, William remained with his unexpected guests. He'd pulled a chair from the dining room and positioned it where he could watch over them without intruding on their space. The mare had relaxed considerably as the hours passed. She grazed contentedly from the hay Thomas had spread on the floor, and the foals had begun to explore their surroundings with increasing confidence. Mrs. Henderson appeared with a tray of supper, cold meat, bread, and a pitcher of lemonade that looked like heaven in the stifling heat. "The whole town's talking," she reported as she set the tray on a side table. Young Peter couldn't keep quiet about the horses in the manor. "By now I'd wager half of Esperanza knows about your unusual guests." William felt a flicker of something that might have been anxiety. He'd grown accustomed to privacy, to keeping his grief and his life carefully contained within these walls. The thought of becoming the subject of town gossip was distinctly uncomfortable, but as he looked at the mare, she'd begun to doze, standing up. Her foals pressed close to her sides in perfect trust. He found he didn't care what anyone thought. For the first time in 3 years, his house felt alive. Dawn came with the same relentless promise of heat, but William found himself awake before the sun, drawn from his bed by an unfamiliar sound echoing through the manor. It took him a moment to identify it, the soft nickering of horses, coming from his great hall. The events of the previous day seemed almost dreamlike in the grey pre-dawn light. But as he descended the main staircase, the reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. The mare stood in a shaft of early sunlight, streaming through the open doors, her coat gleaming with health that had returned overnight. The foals were nursing, their small tails switching contentedly. "Good morning," William said softly, not wanting to startle them. The mare's ears pricked toward him, and she regarded him with what seemed like recognition. "Sleep well?" Thomas appeared from the direction of the kitchen, carrying fresh hay and a bucket of oats. "Been up since 4, he said with satisfaction. "Wanted to check on our guests." The little ones were on their feet and exploring by dawn. William watched as Thomas approached the horses with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life around animals. The mare allowed him to stroke her neck while the foals investigated his pockets for treats. "Found something interesting while I was cleaning their hooves," Thomas said, producing a worn cavalry brush from his coat. "Haven't seen one of these in years. Brought back memories of my army days." The brush was military issue, its wooden handle smoothed by countless hands, its bristles still firm despite obvious age. William took it, feeling the familiar weight. He'd owned one just like it during his own service, before Margaret, before this life of careful solitude. "You served?" William asked, though he realized he'd never thought to inquire about Thomas's past before his employment at the estate. 10th Cavalry, for 8 years. "Worked with horses mostly, breaking them, training them, caring for them." Thomas's weathered face softened with memory. "There's something about horses, Your Grace. They don't lie, don't pretend to be something they're not. What you see is what you get." William ran his thumb along the brush's handle, remembering the ritual of grooming his mount each morning, the meditative quality of the work, the simple satisfaction of caring for another living creature that depended on him. "Would you mind if I—" he began, gesturing toward the mare. Thomas smiled and stepped back. "She's taken to you already. Look at how she watches you." It was true. The mare's attention seemed to follow William wherever he moved. her large, dark eyes tracking his movements with an interest that went beyond simple awareness. When he approached her with the brush, she stood perfectly still, as if she understood the ritual that was about to unfold. The first stroke brought back a flood of memories. The weight of the brush, the resistance of the horse's coat, the quiet intimacy of caring for another creature, it all felt as familiar as breathing. The mare leaned into the grooming, clearly enjoying the attention. "What should we call you?" William murmured as he worked. The mare's response was to turn her head slightly, as if considering the question. "Grace," he said suddenly, the name appearing in his mind unbidden. "You led your children to safety with such grace under pressure." The mare, Grace, nickered softly, as if approving of her new name. "And the little ones?" Thomas asked, watching the foals explore their surroundings with increasing boldness. William studied them as he continued brushing their mother. The dark bay foal had his mother's intelligent eyes and steady demeanor, while the chestnut filly possessed an energy that seemed barely contained, even in rest. "Hope," he said, indicating the chestnut filly. "And courage," he added, nodding toward the colt. "Names for what they represent." Mrs. Henderson appeared with the morning coffee, her face showing none of the shock from the day before. She'd clearly made her peace with the situation overnight. "I've prepared breakfast for you in the dining room, Your Grace," she said. "And I took the liberty of asking cook to prepare some warm mash for our equine guests. She used to keep horses before coming to work here." As William sat at his dining table, the doors to the great hall open so he could keep watch over the horses, he found himself eating with more appetite than he'd shown in months. The simple act of caring for Grace had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Margaret's death. "Mrs. Henderson," he called as she cleared his dishes. "What are people in town saying about yesterday?" The housekeeper paused, her expression diplomatic. "There's been some talk, sir. Some folks think it's quite remarkable, a testament to your kind heart. Others—" she hesitated. "Others think I've lost my mind." William finished for her. "People fear what they don't understand. Your Grace, and kindness toward animals when humans are struggling can seem—" She searched for the right word. "Misplaced to some," William nodded, having expected as much. The drought had made everyone harder, more focused on immediate survival than on gestures that might seem purely sentimental. After breakfast, he found himself drawn back to the great hall. Grace had finished her morning meal and was dozing in the sunlight, while hope and courage explored every corner of their unusual home with fearless curiosity. He settled into his chair with Margaret's garden journal, intending to read while keeping watch over his guests. But instead of opening the book, he found himself studying Grace's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the way she seemed to assess and catalogue everything around her. "You chose to come here," he said quietly. "But how did you know? What made you think you'd find sanctuary here?" Grace opened her eyes at the sound of his voice, regarding him with that same steady attention. For a moment, William could swear she was listening not just to his words, but to something deeper, the questions he couldn't articulate, the loneliness he'd carried for 3 years. Thomas joined him in the afternoon, settling into a second chair with the easy manner of a man comfortable with silence. "Reminds me of a mare I knew in the service," he said eventually. "Smartest horse I ever worked with. She could read people better than most humans could." "How so?" "She knew who was afraid, who was angry, who was sad. Treated each person differently based on what they needed. Gentle with the young soldiers, firm with the ones who got too rough, patient with the ones who were homesick." Thomas paused, studying Grace. "This one has that same quality. She knew to come here, knew you'd help." William considered this. "What happened to your mare?" "The one from the service?" Thomas's expression grew distant. "Lost her in a skirmish with raiders. She took an arrow meant for me, stayed on her feet long enough to get me to safety." He was quiet for a long moment. "I blame myself for years. Thought I should have been more careful, more aware. But you weren't responsible for the raiders' actions," William said gently. "No, but I was responsible for her care. Just like you were responsible for Margaret's happiness while she was with you." Thomas looked directly at William, The difference is knowing when responsibility ends and life just happens. The words hit William with unexpected force. In all his carefully maintained grief, he'd never considered that possibility, that some things simply happened, that caring for someone didn't make him responsible for every outcome. As the afternoon heat began to build, Hope wandered over to William's chair and nuzzled his hand with her soft muzzle. Without thinking, he reached out to stroke her neck, marveling at the trust she showed. "She likes you," Thomas observed. "The feeling is mutual," William admitted, surprised by the truth of it. For the first time in 3 years, he was caring for something beyond mere duty or obligation. These horses had awakened something in him that he'd thought was buried with Margaret, the simple pleasure of nurturing another living creature, of being needed and trusted. As evening approached and the temperature began its slight reprieve, William made a decision that surprised even him. "Thomas, I want to keep them," the groundskeeper smiled. "I figured you might. They've already made themselves at home. People will talk. People always talk. Question is whether you care more about their opinions or about doing what feels right." William looked at Grace, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and at Hope and Courage, who had spent the day exploring their new home with the confidence of creatures who knew they were safe. "I care about doing what's right," he said finally, and for the first time since Margaret's death, he felt certain he knew what that was. The whispers began on the 3rd day. William first noticed them during his weekly trip to Esperanza for supplies. The usual nods and respectful greetings seemed more reserved, accompanied by sideways glances and conversations that died abruptly when he approached. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, was polite but distant as she filled his order. "Will that be all, Your Grace?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes, thank you." William gathered his parcels, aware of the unusual silence in the normally bustling store. Outside, he overheard fragments of conversation from a group of ranchers gathered near the hitching posts. Keeping wild animals in his house like pets, not natural. "If you ask me, grief does strange things to a man." William walked to his wagon with measured steps, refusing to hurry despite the uncomfortable awareness of being watched and discussed. He'd expected some reaction to his unusual household guests, but the weight of collective judgment was heavier than he'd anticipated. The ride back to the estate gave him time to think. By the time he reached his front gates, he'd made peace with the town's disapproval. Grace, Hope, and Courage had claimed not just space in his home, but something deeper. A part of his heart he'd thought was permanently closed. Dr. Collins was waiting for him on the front steps, his medical bag at his side and an expression of professional concern on his face. "William," he said as the Duke approached, "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. I wanted to check on your patience and—" He paused. "I thought we should talk." William invited him inside, where Grace and her foals had settled into their routine as naturally as if they'd always belonged there. The mare stood in her favorite spot near the windows, while Hope and Courage dozed in the afternoon sunlight. Dr. Collins examined each horse with practiced efficiency, pronounced them in excellent health, then settled into one of the chairs William had positioned in the great hall. "They're thriving," he said. "But William, people are concerned about the horses." "About you." Dr. Collins leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I've known you for 5 years, watched you struggle with Margaret's death, seen you withdraw from the world. But this," he gestured toward the horses, "this has people worried about your state of mind." William felt a familiar stirring of irritation. "My state of mind is perfectly sound. I'm caring for creatures that needed help. In your drawing room. In my home," William corrected firmly. "These horses chose to seek shelter here. Who am I to refuse sanctuary to creatures in need?" Dr. Collins was quiet for a moment, studying William's face. "You know I care about your welfare, we all do. But keeping wild horses in your house, people see it as evidence of an unbalanced mind." Before William could respond, Thomas appeared from the kitchen, carrying a bucket of fresh water for the horses. He set it down carefully, allowing Grace to drink, then straightened to face Dr. Collins. "Begging your pardon, Doctor, but there's nothing unbalanced about compassion. These animals were dying in the heat. The Duke saved their lives. I'm not questioning his compassion, Thomas. I'm concerned about the isolation, the way he's been living since Margaret died. And now this very public display of— Dr. Collins searched for the right word. Eccentricity. William supplied dryly. Grief takes many forms, Dr. Collins said gently. But when it begins to affect one's judgment, my judgment is fine. William's voice carried an edge that made Grace lift her head in interest. I'm housing 3 animals that would have died without intervention. If that strikes people as mad, perhaps they should examine their own hearts. That evening, after Dr. Collins had departed with promises to keep an ear open for any escalating concerns, William found himself going through Margaret's belongings, something he'd avoided for 3 years. In her wardrobe, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, he discovered her riding gloves. They were fine leather, soft from use, sized perfectly for her small hands. The sight of them brought back a rush of memories. Margaret mounted on her favorite mare, laughing as they raced across the grasslands, her hands gentle but confident on the reins. The way she'd insisted that horses could sense a rider's emotions and respond accordingly. You would have loved them, he said aloud, holding the gloves against his chest. Grace especially. She has your same intuitive wisdom. As if summoned by his words, Grace approached him, her hooves silent on the stone floor. She nuzzled his shoulder gently, and William found himself thinking about Margaret's theory that animals could sense human emotions. Can you feel it? He asked Grace quietly. The loneliness I've carried? Is that why you came here? Grace whickered softly, a sound that seemed almost conversational. William spent the evening with the horses, finding peace in their quiet presence. Hope had developed a habit of following him around the great hall, her small hooves clicking cheerfully on the stone. Courage was more reserved but no less trusting, allowing William to stroke his neck while he dozed. It wasn't until the next morning that the full extent of the town's concern became clear. Thomas found him at breakfast, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain. Your Grace, we may have a problem. Mayor Crawley was here early this morning, asking questions about your condition. He seemed particularly interested in whether you'd been acting strangely, making unusual decisions. William set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. Edmund Crawley was a politician first and foremost, a man who saw opportunity in every crisis and weakness in every unconventional choice. What sort of questions? Whether you've been neglecting the estate, making poor business decisions, acting in ways that might suggest— Thomas paused. Mental instability. William felt a cold knot form in his stomach. In the territory, a man's competence to manage his affairs could be legally challenged under certain circumstances. If enough prominent citizens petitioned the territorial court, he could face an evaluation of his mental fitness. Did you tell him anything? I told him the truth, that you've been managing the estate as well as anyone could in this drought, that your decisions have been sound and practical. But Your Grace— Thomas's expression was troubled. He wasn't really listening. He'd already made up his mind about what he wanted to hear. After Thomas left to continue his morning chores, William sat alone with his thoughts and his horses. Grace seemed to sense his troubled mood, positioning herself close to his chair, while hope and courage played nearby. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 3 years, he'd isolated himself from the community, avoiding social obligations and keeping human contact to a minimum. No one had questioned his mental state then, when he'd been genuinely struggling with grief and withdrawal. Now, when he felt more alive and purposeful than he had since Margaret's death, his sanity was being called into question. They think caring for you makes me mad, he told Grace, running his hand along her neck. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps only a madman would choose the company of horses over the approval of his neighbors. Grace nickered softly, as if in disagreement. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her face showing the strain of the morning's visitors. Your Grace, I feel I should tell you, there have been more people asking questions. Mrs. Peterson from the Church Auxiliary, Mr. Jenkins from the Cattlemen's Association. They're all very polite, very concerned about your welfare. and very willing to spread gossip about my supposed decline. I've told them all the same thing, that you're grieving in your own way, but that you're perfectly rational and capable. But, sir, she hesitated, perhaps it would help if you attended some social functions, showed people that you're still engaged with the community. William considered this. The practical part of his mind recognized the wisdom in her suggestion. A few public appearances, some carefully normal behavior, and the gossip would likely die down. But as he looked at Grace and her foals, creatures who had sought sanctuary in his home and found it, he found himself reluctant to compromise. Their presence had awakened something in him that felt too precious to sacrifice for social convenience. Mrs. Henderson, how long have you worked for this family? 15 years, sir. Since before your marriage to Miss Margaret? And in all that time, have you ever seen me make a decision that harmed anyone under my care? No, Your Grace, never. Then perhaps you could help people understand that caring for these horses is simply an extension of that same principle. Mrs. Henderson smiled, her expression warming. I'll do my best, sir. Though I should warn you, some minds are harder to change than others. The afternoon brought Thomas back from town with more disturbing news. Mayor Crawley's been busy, he reported. He's talking to everyone who'll listen about your deteriorating condition. Claims he's gathering evidence to petition for a competency hearing. William felt his jaw tighten. On what grounds? Erratic behavior, poor judgment, inability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate conduct. Thomas's voice carried disgust. He's painting your kindness as madness. That evening, as William sat with the horses in the gathering twilight, he found himself thinking about Margaret's riding gloves, still resting on the table where he'd left them. She'd believed that animals could sense the truth in people's hearts, could recognize genuine kindness beneath social pretenses. Looking at Grace, who watched him with such steady intelligence, he realized that perhaps the horses understood him better than his human neighbors ever had. Tomorrow, he told Grace, we'll show them that compassion isn't madness, that choosing to care isn't a sign of weakness. Grace stepped closer, resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture that felt like encouragement. For the first time in 3 years, William Ashford was ready to fight for something he believed in. The official notice arrived with the Morning Post, delivered by young Peter Morrison with an apologetic expression and muddy boots that left tracks across the marble entryway. Sorry, Your Grace, Peter said, extending the envelope with obvious reluctance. Mayor Crawley insisted I deliver this personally. William accepted the document, noting the formal seal of the Esperanza Town Council pressed into red wax. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the envelope contained more than mere words. Thank you. Peter, please tell your mother I asked after her health, after the boy left. William broke the seal and read the contents. The language was formal and legalistic, but the message was clear. Concerns have been raised regarding the mental competency and fitness of Duke William Ashford to manage his personal and business affairs. A formal hearing was scheduled for the following week. Thomas appeared from the direction of the kitchen, took one look at William's expression, and knew immediately what the letter contained. They've done it then. 3 signatures required, William said, scanning the document. Mayor Crawley, of course. Justice Patterson from the county court, and he paused, feeling a stab of betrayal. Dr. Collins? Dr. Collins signed it. Thomas's weathered face showed genuine shock. But he was just here, examining the horses, talking about their good health. William folded the letter carefully, his movements precise despite the anger building in his chest. Apparently, concern for my welfare overrides respect for my autonomy. Behind them, Grace whickered softly, as if sensing the tension in the room. The mare had developed an uncanny ability to read human emotions, often approaching when comfort was needed or maintaining distance when space was required. What does this mean, practically speaking? Thomas asked. It means I have 7 days to prepare to defend my sanity before a panel of my peers. William's voice carried a bitter edge. 7 days to prove that caring for 3 horses doesn't constitute evidence of mental deterioration. Mrs. Henderson bustled in from the dining room, carrying a tea service that she set down with more force than necessary. "The whole thing is nonsense," she declared. "I've worked for families across 3 territories, and I've never seen a more reasonable, capable master than yourself. Those horses have brought more life to this house than it's seen in 3 years." William studied the formal summons again, noting the specific charges: allowing wild animals to inhabit human living spaces, making decisions contrary to accepted social norms, and displaying judgment compromised by prolonged grief. The accusations stung because they contained just enough truth to seem plausible. He had allowed horses to live in his drawing room. He was making decisions that defied conventional wisdom, and he had been shaped by grief, though not in the way his accusers suggested. "Thomas, I need you to do something for me," William said. "I want you to research the backgrounds of everyone who signed this petition. Employment history, personal business, anything that might explain their motivations. You think there's more to this than concern for your welfare? I think Edmund Crawley is a politician who sees opportunity in crisis. The question is, what kind of opportunity?" As Thomas departed on his investigative mission, William found himself alone with his thoughts and his horses. Grace had settled near the windows, where the morning light caught the highlights in her dark coat. Hope and Courage were engaged in one of their endless games, chasing each other around the great hall with the boundless energy of youth. For creatures that had arrived at death's door just a week ago, they showed remarkable resilience. Their recovery had been complete, and their adaptation to domestic life seamless. They seemed to understand instinctively which areas of the house were theirs to explore and which were off limits. "You've brought me nothing but joy," William said to Grace. "And for that, apparently I'm to be declared incompetent." Grace approached him, resting her great head against his chest in a gesture that had become familiar. The simple contact was comforting in a way that human sympathy rarely managed to be. Dr. Collins arrived just before noon, his face grave with the weight of difficult duty. William received him in the study rather than the great hall, wanting to maintain some formality for what was clearly going to be an uncomfortable conversation. "William, I hope you understand that I signed that petition with the greatest reluctance. Did you?" William's tone was carefully neutral. "Because from my perspective, it seems you've decided to cure my grief by declaring me insane." Dr. Collins winced. "That's not what this is about. I'm genuinely concerned about your state of mind. The isolation, the withdrawal from social contact, and now this fixation on these animals." Fixation. William's control slipped slightly. "I'm caring for 3 creatures that would have died without intervention. If that's madness, then perhaps sanity is overrated. You're keeping horses in your drawing room, William. You've created a shrine to your dead wife, and now you're talking to animals as if they were human companions. These aren't the behaviors of a balanced mind." William felt something cold settle in his chest. "I see. And your professional opinion is that I'm unfit to manage my own affairs. I think you need help, guidance, perhaps some time away from this place, where you can gain perspective on what you've lost and what you still have to offer the world." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but William barely listened. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected. Dr. Collins had been Margaret's physician, had fought alongside William to save her life, had shared in the grief of her loss. To have him turn that shared experience into evidence of madness felt like a violation of everything they'd been through together. After the doctor left, William walked out to the great hall where Grace and her foals were enjoying their afternoon rest. The sight of them brought a moment of peace to his troubled thoughts. "They want to separate us," he told Grace. "They think caring for you is evidence that I've lost my mind." Grace nickered softly, a sound that seemed almost conversational. "But here's what they don't understand," William continued, settling into his usual chair. "You've given me back something I thought was gone forever. The ability to care for another living creature, without fear of loss." Thomas returned in the late afternoon, with information. That confirmed William's suspicions. Mayor Crawley's been having financial troubles, he reported. Word is, he's borrowed heavily against future development prospects, but the drought's dried up most investment interest. And my estate? 2,000 acres of prime land, plus water rights that could be valuable even in dry years. If you were declared incompetent, the territorial court might appoint a conservator to manage your affairs. William nodded grimly. And who better to recommend as conservator than the concerned mayor, who raised the alarm about my condition? There's more, Thomas continued. Justice Patterson's been approached about selling his land to a mining consortium. They're interested in the whole valley, but your estate sits right in the middle of their target area. The pieces were falling into place with depressing clarity. His genuine grief, his isolation, and now his unconventional care for the horses were being weaponized against him by people who saw opportunity in his perceived vulnerability. What about Dr. Collins? Thomas's expression softened slightly. I think he's genuinely worried about you, Your Grace. He's not part of any conspiracy, just a man who's seen too many people destroyed by grief and thinks he's preventing another tragedy. That evening, as William sat with the horses in the gathering twilight, he felt a resolve crystallizing that he hadn't experienced since his military service. He'd been content to live quietly, to grieve privately, to avoid the complications of community engagement, but they'd forced his hand. By threatening not just his freedom, but his ability to care for Grace and her foals, they'd awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. Next week, he told Grace, we're going to show them what real madness looks like. We're going to fight. The nights had become William's sanctuary for deeper reflection. After the heat of each day subsided and the horses settled into their evening rest, he would sit in Margaret's favorite chair and allow himself to remember not just her death, but her life, and more importantly, her beliefs about how life should be lived. Tonight, with the competency hearing looming just days away, he found himself drawn to her personal Bible. He'd avoided it for 3 years, unable to bear the sight of her careful handwriting in the margins, her thoughts and prayers preserved in fading ink. The leather binding was soft with age and use, the pages marked with ribbons and small pressed flowers she'd collected from her garden. As he opened it, her presence seemed to fill the room with the same gentle certainty she'd brought to everything she touched. Her notes were everywhere, observations about love, forgiveness and faith written in her precise script. But it was a passage in Proverbs that stopped him cold. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Beneath it, Margaret had written, true strength is not in isolation, but in choosing to remain open to love, even when love brings the risk of loss. We honor the dead not by closing our hearts, but by keeping them tender enough to help the living. William stared at the words until they blurred. For 3 years, he'd convinced himself that his withdrawal was a form of honoring Margaret's memory, preserving something precious by protecting it from further damage. But her own words suggested he'd been wrong. I've been hiding, he said aloud, and Grace lifted her head from where she dozed nearby. I've been calling it grief, but it's been fear. The mare approached him with that uncanny sensitivity she'd shown from the first day, resting her head against his arm. In the growing darkness, with only a single lamp casting warm light across the great hall, William felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight control he'd maintained for so long. Thomas appeared from the direction of the kitchen, carrying his evening cup of coffee and settling into the chair he'd claimed as his own. Couldn't sleep either. The groundskeeper asked. Reading Margaret's Bible, William admitted. Trying to understand what she'd want me to do about this hearing. Thomas sipped his coffee thoughtfully. What do you think she'd say? That I should fight, but not just for myself, for the principle, for the idea that compassion isn't madness, that caring for others isn't a sign of weakness. And William closed the Bible gently, his decision crystallizing. She'd say I've been letting fear masquerade as faithfulness, that true honor comes from living fully, not from preserving a monument to the past. The next morning brought unexpected support from an unlikely source. Mrs. Henderson announced that Mrs. Patterson, wife of the justice who'd signed the petition, was requesting an audience. Elena Patterson was a small woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd run the church auxiliary for 15 years and was known throughout the territory for her forthright manner and uncompromising principles. Duke Ashford, she said as she settled into a chair in his study. "I've come to apologize for my husband's involvement in this shameful business." William blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Patterson, let me speak my piece," she interrupted with characteristic directness. "James signed that petition because Edmund Crawley convinced him it was his civic duty. But I've had 3 days to think about it, and I've come to some conclusions." She paused to accept the tea Mrs. Henderson offered, then continued. "I knew your wife, Duke Ashford. Margaret was one of the finest women I've ever had the privilege to know. Generous, faithful, wise beyond her years. Do you know what she told me once about animal welfare?" William shook his head, intrigued despite himself. "She said that how a society treats its most vulnerable creatures, children, animals, the elderly, reveals everything you need to know about its moral character. She said that kindness to animals wasn't sentimental foolishness, but a reflection of divine compassion." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her expression intense. "So when I hear that you've opened your home to creatures in desperate need, I don't see madness. I see Margaret's influence living on in you, and anyone who calls that insanity is revealing more about themselves than about you." The conversation lasted another hour, with Mrs. Patterson sharing insights about the political maneuvering behind the petition and offering her support for the coming hearing. "I can't change James's signature," she said as she prepared to leave, "but I can make sure people understand what this is really about: power, money, and the fear of anyone who chooses compassion over convenience." That afternoon, William found himself facing an internal reckoning that had been building since the horses' arrival. Standing in the great hall, watching Hope and Courage play while Grace dozed in the afternoon sunlight, he realized that their trust had taught him something crucial about healing. These animals had arrived at his door broken and desperate, yet they'd recovered not by hiding from risk, but by accepting care. They'd allowed themselves to be vulnerable, to depend on another creature's compassion, to rebuild their strength through trust rather than isolation. "I've been doing this backwards, haven't I?" he said to Grace. "You came here dying and chose to trust. I've been alive but choosing to hide." Grace's response was to approach him and rest her forehead against his chest, a gesture that had become their private ritual of understanding. Thomas found him there an hour later, still standing with Grace in companionable silence. "Your Grace, I've been thinking about the hearing," Thomas said. "We need witnesses who can speak to your character, your competence, your state of mind, who would stand up for a man who keeps horses in his drawing room. More people than you might expect. Mrs. Patterson's already offered. There's Dr. Morrison from the next county over. He's treated animals here and can speak to your rational approach to their care. Some of the ranch hands from neighboring properties have been talking about how you've helped them through the drought." William felt a stirring of something that might have been hope. "I hadn't realized people were paying attention. Kindness gets noticed, even when you try to hide it," Thomas said with a slight smile. "Especially when you try to hide it." That evening, William made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of his usual quiet dinner alone, he invited Thomas and Mrs. Henderson to join him at the dining room table, with the doors open so they could keep watch over their equine guests. "We're going into this hearing as a family," he announced, as they shared Margaret's good china and wine from his private cellar. "These horses aren't just animals I'm sheltering. They're part of this household now, and anyone who wants to tear us apart will have to prove we're wrong to care for each other." Mrs. Henderson raised her wine glass with tears in her eyes. "To family," she said. "To family," Thomas echoed. "And to Grace, Hope, and Courage," William added, "who taught us all what trust looks like." As they toasted, Grace nickered softly from her place by the windows, as if adding her own blessing to their newfound unity. For the first time in 3 years, William Ashford's house truly felt like a home. The discovery came by accident, as the most important revelations often do. William was grooming Grace in preparation for the hearing, an activity that had become as much therapy for him as care for her, when his brush caught on something unusual beneath her thick mane. What he'd assumed was a tangle of hair proved to be something else entirely, a section of her coat that had been clipped short and was just beginning to grow back. Beneath the returning hair, pressed into her skin with the clarity of fine metalwork, was a brand mark he recognized with a shock that nearly stole his breath. The mark was a stylized H enclosed in a circle, the brand of the Hartwell Ranch, Margaret's family property 300 miles to the north. William's hands stilled on the brush as the implications crashed over him like a cold wave. This wasn't just any horse that had wandered onto his property. This was one of Margaret's brother's mares, from the ranch where she'd learned to ride, where she'd spent her childhood summers. "Thomas!" he called, his voice tight with emotion. "Thomas, come quickly!" The groundskeeper appeared within moments, took one look at William's expression, and hurried to his side. "Look at this," William said, parting Grace's mane to reveal the brand clearly. "Do you know what this means?" Thomas studied the mark, his weathered face showing gradual recognition. "That's the Hartwell brand. But, Your Grace, the Hartwell Ranch was abandoned after the war. When Margaret's brother died at Gettysburg, his widow couldn't maintain it alone," William finished. "She sold off the livestock and moved back east to live with family." He stared at the brand, his mind racing. "But some of the horses must have escaped during the sale. They've been living wild all these years." The revelation reframed everything. Grace hadn't simply chosen his property at random during her desperate flight from the heat. Somehow, through instinct or inherited memory, she'd brought her foals to the one place on earth where Margaret's family was still honored and remembered. "She knew," William whispered, running his hands along Grace's neck with new reverence. "Somehow she knew to come here." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of the discovery. "Your Grace, there's something I should tell you. I suspected this might be the case, but I wasn't certain until now." William turned to face him, seeing guilt in the older man's expression. "I recognized her the first day. Not her specifically, but her type. The Hartwell horses had a distinctive look, a certain way of carrying themselves. Your late brother-in-law bred for intelligence as much as strength. Why didn't you say anything?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I thought it might be too painful for you. Reminders of Margaret's family, of everything that was lost in the war. And I wasn't sure until I saw that brand. I couldn't be certain." William felt a complex mix of emotions. Anger at Thomas for keeping the secret, gratitude for his consideration, and overwhelming awe at the miraculous nature of Grace's arrival. "Do you understand what this means?" William asked, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This isn't just about saving 3 random horses. Margaret's family blood runs in their veins. They're the last living connection to her childhood, her history, everything that made her who she was." Grace seemed to sense the importance of the conversation, standing perfectly still as William examined her more carefully. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see the Hartwell characteristics, the intelligent eyes, the proud carriage, the particular way she held her head that had reminded him of something familiar from the first day. "Margaret always said those horses were special," William continued, memories flooding back. "She claimed they could sense things other animals couldn't, that they had an almost mystical connection to the people they trusted, as if summoned by the mention of her name." Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, took one look at the scene, and knew immediately that something significant had occurred. "What is it?" she asked. William showed her the brand, explained the connection, watched understanding dawn in her eyes. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she breathed. "Margaret's family horses, after all these years." "It changes everything about the hearing," William said, his legal mind already working through the implications. I'm not just sheltering random animals. I'm preserving living links to my wife's heritage. Any judge would understand the sentimental value, the historical importance. But even as he spoke, William realized the discovery meant something deeper than legal strategy. For 3 years, he'd struggled with the question of how to honor Margaret's memory without being trapped by it. He'd preserved her belongings, maintained her garden as a shrine, kept her room exactly as she'd left it. Now, caring for these horses, he was doing something different, not preserving the past, but nurturing its continuation into the future. She would have wanted this, he said with sudden certainty. Margaret would have wanted me to care for them, to give them the home her brother's death made impossible. Thomas nodded slowly. Makes sense now why Grace was so determined to reach this specific place. These horses carry memory in their blood, not just of Margaret's brother, but of the whole Hartwell line going back generations. As the afternoon progressed, William found himself studying hope and courage with new eyes. The colt had Margaret's brother's strong build and fearless nature, qualities that had made Robert Hartwell one of the finest cavalry officers in the Union Army before a Confederate. The bullet ended his life at age 26. The filly showed different traits, more delicate features, but with an intelligence that seemed almost human. She reminded William powerfully of Margaret herself, not in appearance, but in the way she seemed to understand conversations happening around her. They're not just horses, he told Thomas as they watched the foals play. They're living history, the last remnant of a family that gave everything for this country. Dr. Collins arrived for his afternoon visit to find William in a state of emotional intensity he hadn't seen since the immediate aftermath of Margaret's death. William, what's happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. In a way, I have, William replied, showing him the brand. These aren't wild horses, Samuel. They're Margaret's family stock, the last of the Hartwell bloodline. Dr. Collins examined the brand with professional thoroughness, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. This changes the entire situation, he said finally. No one could question your decision to preserve animals with such personal and historical significance. But it's more than that, William said, settling into his chair while Grace took her customary position nearby. For 3 years, I've been trying to figure out how to grieve properly, how to honor Margaret without being destroyed by the loss. I've been treating her memory like a museum piece, something to be preserved behind glass, protected from the contamination of ongoing life. He paused, watching hope nuzzle against Grace's flank. But these horses show me a different way. They carry forward something essential from the past while remaining fully alive in the present. They honor their heritage not by standing still, but by growing, changing, creating new life. Dr. Collins was quiet for a long moment, studying William's face. You're different, he said finally. Since these horses arrived, you're more present, more engaged. I thought it was concerning, but now you see it's healing, William finished. The horses didn't drive me toward madness. They drew me back toward sanity. That evening, as William sat with his unexpected family in the gathering twilight, he felt a peace settling over him that he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Grace and her foals represented something precious, not a return to the past, but a bridge between what was lost and what could still be built. Tomorrow, he would face the hearing with this knowledge as his foundation, not just as a man defending his right to care for animals, but as the guardian of living history, the protector of Margaret's legacy in its truest form. Thank you, he whispered to Grace. And the mare's response was to rest her great head against his shoulder, a gesture that felt like blessing, forgiveness, and promise all at once. The morning of the hearing dawned with the same relentless heat that had brought Grace to his door. But William found himself facing it with a composure that surprised even him. As he dressed in his finest suit, the dark blue wool that Margaret had helped him choose for their wedding, he felt her presence more strongly than he had since her death. Today we fight for more than just our right to stay together, he told Grace as she stood in her customary morning position by the windows. Today, we honor everyone who believed that love is stronger than convention. Thomas had risen before dawn to prepare the horses for their brief separation. Though they would remain at the manor during the hearing, this would be the longest William had been away from them since their arrival. "They'll be fine," Thomas assured him, though the groundskeeper's own anxiety showed in the careful way he checked and rechecked the arrangements. "Mrs. Henderson and I will keep close watch." Dr. Collins arrived precisely at 8, his expression grave with the weight of what lay ahead. "William, I need you to know that I've been reconsidering my position. The discovery about Grace's heritage, the way you've responded to this situation, I think I may have misjudged the nature of your attachment to these animals. Will you withdraw your signature from the petition?" Dr. Collins looked troubled. "I can't undo what I've done, but I can testify honestly about what I've observed. Your mental state has improved dramatically since the horses arrived. If anything, they've brought you back to life." The ride into Esperanza was conducted in thoughtful silence, both men lost in their own preparations for the ordeal ahead. The town was busier than William had seen it in months. Word of the hearing had drawn curious spectators from neighboring settlements, all eager to witness the proceedings. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the street. William recognized faces from across the territory, ranchers he'd done business with, church members who'd attended Margaret's funeral, merchants who depended on his trade. Mayor Crawley was holding court near the front steps, his voice carrying clearly as he explained to anyone who would listen why this hearing was necessary. "A man in his position has responsibilities," Crawley was saying. "When grief compromises judgment to the point where wild animals are treated as house pets, the community has an obligation to intervene." William walked past without acknowledgement, his dignity intact despite the whispers that followed in his wake. Inside, he took his designated seat and surveyed the panel that would determine his fate. Justice Patterson sat in the center, his weathered face carefully neutral despite the conversation with his wife that had clearly given him pause. To his right was Judge Morrison from the county seat, a man known for his fairness and thorough consideration of evidence. To his left sat Dr. Richards, the territorial physician who would evaluate the medical evidence regarding William's mental state. "Before we begin," Justice Patterson announced, "I want to make clear that this hearing is not a trial. We're here to determine whether Duke William Ashford requires assistance in managing his affairs due to mental incapacity. The burden of proof lies with those who initiated these proceedings." Mr. Crawley rose to present the case against William's competency, his politician's instincts serving him well as he painted a picture of a man undone by grief and isolation. "Gentlemen, we're dealing with someone who has withdrawn from all social contact, who makes decisions based on sentiment rather than reason, who has created a living situation that defies all conventional wisdom." Crawley gestured dramatically. "This isn't about condemning kindness. It's about recognizing when kindness becomes compulsion, when compassion becomes obsession." The mayor called his first witness, Mrs. Brennan from the general store, who testified that William's behavior had become increasingly erratic over the past 3 years. "He barely speaks when he comes to town," she said. "Just conducts his business and leaves. Never socializes, never joins in community events. It's not natural for a man his age to be so isolated." William's attorney, a sharp young lawyer from the county seat named James Mitchell, cross-examined with gentle precision. "Mrs. Brennan, would you describe the Duke's business transactions as competent?" "Well, yes, but has he ever failed to pay his debts promptly?" "No, but that's not the point. Has he ever been anything but courteous in his dealings with you?" "He's always been polite, yes." Mitchell let the testimony stand, having made his point about the difference between social withdrawal and mental incompetence. Dr. Collins was called next, and his testimony proved more complex than either side had anticipated. "I signed the petition because I was genuinely concerned about William's isolation and what seemed like an unhealthy fixation on these animals," he began. But I must say that my opinion has evolved as I've observed the situation more closely. Mayor Crawley looked alarmed. Dr. Collins, surely you maintain that keeping horses in one's drawing room indicates impaired judgment. Actually, no. What I've observed is a man who has found purpose and healing through caring for creatures that needed him. His mental state has improved dramatically since the horses arrived. If anything, they've served as effective therapy for his grief. The doctor's testimony carried considerable weight, coming as it did from someone who had initially supported the petition. Thomas took the stand next, his weathered hands steady as he swore his oath. The groundskeeper had dressed in his Sunday best, his usually wild hair tamed and his bearing dignified, despite his obvious discomfort with formal proceedings. "Thomas Garrett," he said when asked to state his name. "I've been groundskeeper at the Ashford estate for 8 years. Mitchell guided him through his observations of William's competence, his management of the estate, his rational decision-making during the drought crisis. In your professional opinion, Mr. Garrett, is Duke Ashford capable of managing his affairs?" "More than capable," Thomas replied firmly. "He's kept that estate running through the worst drought in living memory, made hard decisions about livestock, water management, crop allocation. Every choice has been sound and practical, and regarding the horses..." Thomas straightened in his chair. "Those animals were dying when they arrived. The Duke's decision to shelter them saved their lives. I've worked with horses for 40 years, and I've never seen better care or more rational treatment of distressed animals." Mayor Crawley's cross-examination focused on the unusual nature of housing horses indoors. But Thomas held his ground. "With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, wisdom isn't about following convention. It's about responding appropriately to circumstances. Those horses needed immediate cooling and shelter. The Duke provided both. They survived and thrived because of his actions." Mrs. Patterson rose unexpectedly from the gallery, requesting permission to address the court. "Elena Patterson," she announced. "I've lived in this territory for 23 years, and I knew Margaret Ashford personally." Justice Patterson, her husband, looked uncomfortable but nodded for her to continue. "Margaret Ashford believed that how we treat the most vulnerable among us reveals our true character. What I've seen from Duke Ashford is exactly the kind of compassion she would have expected from him. To call that madness is to misunderstand both mercy and sanity." Her words carried the weight of moral authority that came from decades of community leadership, and William felt a surge of gratitude for her courage. The surprise witness was Dr. Morrison from the neighboring county, a veterinarian who had examined the horses at Mitchell's request. "These animals show no signs of stress or mistreatment," he testified. "In fact, they demonstrate remarkable health and contentment. Their behavior around Duke Ashford suggests deep trust and affection. This isn't the relationship you'd see between mentally unstable person and frightened animals, but it was Mitchell's presentation of the final piece of evidence that transformed the entire proceeding. He produced detailed photographs of Grace's brand mark, along with historical documentation proving her connection to the Hartwell Ranch. Gentlemen, what we're dealing with here isn't a man who has lost his reason, but one who has discovered his purpose. These aren't random horses. They're the last survivors of a bloodline that connects directly to his late wife's family heritage." The revelation sent a murmur through the packed courtroom. Mitchell continued, his voice growing stronger. "Robert Hartwell died at Gettysburg in service to this nation. His horses were scattered when his widow could no longer maintain the ranch. Through some miracle of instinct or providence, one of his mares led her foals to the home of his sister's widower, the one place where they would be recognized, valued and cared for." Justice Patterson leaned forward, clearly affected by this new information. "You're suggesting that Duke Ashford's actions represent not madness, but stewardship." "I'm suggesting that his actions represent exactly the kind of thoughtful, principled decision-making we should expect from someone entrusted with preserving family legacy and local history." Mayor Crawley attempted to argue that the horse's heritage didn't excuse the unconventional living arrangements, but his position had been severely weakened. The narrative had shifted from eccentric grief to noble preservation. During the brief recess, William found himself surrounded by supporters he hadn't known he possessed. Ranch hands from neighboring properties, members of Margaret's former social circle, even some of the merchants who had seemed aloof during his years of isolation. "Never should have come to this," muttered Jake Harrison, whose cattle William had helped relocate during the worst of the drought. "Man has the right to care for family stock however he sees fit." Mrs. Henderson had arrived during the morning session, her presence adding weight to the growing show of community support. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "whatever happens here today, you should know that those horses brought life back to that house. Anyone with eyes can see the difference in you." As the hearing resumed, William realized that something fundamental had changed. For 3 years, he'd lived in careful isolation, assuming that his grief had made him unsuitable for normal human society. But the support he was seeing suggested that people had been waiting for him to engage, ready to welcome him back when he was ready. Mitchell called William himself as the final witness. And as he walked to the stand, William felt Margaret's presence more strongly than ever. Not the grieving presence of his long sorrow, but the encouraging, confident woman who had believed in his capacity for love and leadership. "Duke Ashford," Mitchell began, "please tell the court why you made the decision to shelter these horses in your home." William looked out at the packed courtroom, seeing faces that had watched him struggle through grief and were now witnessing his emergence from it. "Because they needed help," he said simply, "and because sometimes the most important choice we can make is to care for something beyond ourselves, even when that care defies convention, even knowing it would subject you to criticism, to legal challenge." William's voice grew stronger. "Especially then. True compassion isn't convenient or comfortable. It requires us to risk something of ourselves for the welfare of others." As he spoke about Grace's intelligence, the Foals' recovery, the way their trust had taught him to engage with life again, William saw understanding dawning on faces throughout the courtroom. This wasn't the testimony of a man broken by grief, but of someone who had found his way back to purpose through service to others, even when those others walked on 4 legs. Tomorrow would bring the panel's decision, but Wynne already knew the most important verdict had been reached. He was no longer the isolated, grief-stricken man who had hidden behind his walls of sorrow. He was ready to rejoin the world, not as he had been before Margaret's death, but as someone transformed by loss into a deeper understanding of what it meant to love without reservation. The courthouse fell into expectant silence as Justice Patterson called the hearing back to order. The 3-man panel had spent an hour deliberating, and their decision would determine not just William's legal status, but the future of his unlikely family. William sat with his hands folded, outwardly calm despite the storm of emotions churning beneath the surface. Around him, the packed courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "Before we announce our decision," Justice Patterson began, "I want to address some observations that have emerged during these proceedings." The justice's weathered face was serious, but not unkind, as he looked directly at William. "Duke Ashford, this community has watched you withdraw from social engagement following your wife's tragic death. Many of us attributed this withdrawal to natural grief, while others began to worry that isolation was becoming something more troubling." William felt his throat tighten, but forced himself to maintain steady eye contact. "The petition before us today asked us to determine whether your recent actions regarding the horses indicate mental incompetence requiring intervention. However, the evidence presented has raised different questions entirely." Justice Patterson glanced at his fellow panel members before continuing. "Dr. Richards, would you share your professional assessment?" The territorial physician rose from his seat, consulting notes he'd taken throughout the hearing. "Gentlemen, I've observed Duke Ashford carefully today, and I've reviewed testimony from multiple witnesses regarding his behavior over recent weeks. What I see is not a man whose judgment has been compromised by grief, but rather someone who has found a healthy way to process loss through purposeful action. Dr. Richards paused, his clinical tone softening slightly. The decision to shelter these animals, particularly given their connection to his late wife's family, demonstrates rational thought, compassionate response to genuine need, and appropriate stewardship of historically significant livestock. These are not the actions of an incompetent person. A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom, but Justice Patterson raised his hand for silence. "Judge Morrison, your assessment." The county judge stood, his expression thoughtful. "What strikes me most about this case is the transformation multiple witnesses have described in Duke Ashford's demeanor and engagement level since the horse's arrival. Far from being evidence of mental deterioration, his care for these animals appears to have facilitated emotional healing and renewed purpose." Judge Morrison looked directly at Mayor Crawley. "The petitioners have failed to demonstrate any evidence of actual incompetence. Managing one's estate successfully, making rational decisions about animal care, and choosing to grieve in an unconventional manner are not indicators of mental incapacity." William felt a wave of relief so strong it threatened to overwhelm him. But Justice Patterson wasn't finished. "However, this hearing has revealed something else that concerns this panel. Mayor Crawley, would you approach the bench?" The mayor's confident demeanor faltered slightly as he walked forward. Justice Patterson's voice carried a new edge of authority. "Mr. Crawley, testimony presented today suggests that your concerns about Duke Ashford's competence may have been motivated by factors beyond pure civic duty. Would you care to explain your recent inquiries about the availability of his property for development purposes?" The courthouse erupted in surprised murmurs as the political machinery behind the petition began to show itself. Mayor Crawley's face flushed red, but he attempted to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, any conversations I may have had about future land use were purely preliminary discussions about economic development opportunities for the territory. Opportunities that would presumably require Duke Ashford to be declared incompetent and his estate placed under conservatorship." Judge Morrison interjected with obvious distaste. "That's not— I never suggested, Mr. Crawley." Justice Patterson's voice cut through the mayor's stammering. "This panel finds your motivations in initiating this petition to be questionable at best. The evidence suggests you may have attempted to use the judicial system to facilitate a private business arrangement." William watched the exchange with a mixture of vindication and pity. Crawley had overplayed his hand, allowing his political ambitions to override his judgment. "Furthermore," Justice Patterson continued, "the community support demonstrated here today suggests that Duke Ashford's supposed isolation was more perceived than real. Multiple citizens have testified to his continued competence, his assistance during the drought crisis, and his positive contribution to territorial life." The justice looked out over the packed courtroom. This hearing was supposed to determine whether Duke Ashford requires assistance managing his affairs. Instead, it has demonstrated that he has managed his affairs admirably, while also extending compassion to creatures in desperate need. Thomas caught William's eye from across the room and nodded slightly, a gesture of encouragement and solidarity that meant more than any legal ruling. "Could Dr. Collins," Justice Patterson called. "You signed the original petition, but testified today that your opinion has evolved. Would you share your current professional assessment?" The physician stood, his bearing showing the weight of professional integrity. "Your Honor, I initially interpreted Duke Ashford's withdrawal and his unusual living arrangements as concerning symptoms. However, extended observation has shown me that I misunderstood both the nature of his grief process and the therapeutic value of his relationship with these animals." Dr. Collins paused, looking directly at William with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "In my professional opinion, Duke Ashford shows no signs of mental incompetence. If anything, his willingness to care for these horses demonstrates emotional resilience and moral courage that suggest complete mental fitness." The doctor's reversal was complete and public, effectively gutting the medical foundation of the petition. Justice Patterson consulted briefly with his fellow panel members, then stood to deliver the formal ruling. The petition requesting intervention in the affairs of Duke William Ashford is hereby denied. The evidence presented fails to demonstrate any form of mental incompetence or inability to manage personal and business matters. The courthouse erupted in applause. But Justice Patterson wasn't finished. Furthermore, this panel wishes to commend Duke Ashford for his stewardship of historically significant animals and his demonstration of compassion during a community crisis. His actions represent the kind of principled leadership this territory needs. William felt tears threatening for the first time since Margaret's funeral. But these were tears of relief and vindication rather than sorrow. However, the justice continued, raising his voice over the celebration. This panel also wishes to address the broader community about the importance of supporting our neighbors through times of grief, rather than rushing to judgment about unconventional responses to loss. The implied criticism of the community's readiness to condemn rather than support was clear, and William saw several faces in the crowd showing appropriate shame. Justice Patterson's final words carried the weight of official pronouncement. Duke William Ashford is hereby confirmed as fully competent to manage his affairs as he sees fit. This court further recognizes his right to extend hospitality and care to any creatures he deems worthy of sanctuary. Regardless of species or living arrangements, the gavel fell with finality, and the courtroom erupted in genuine celebration. William rose from his seat as the courtroom celebration continued around him, feeling as though he was emerging from a long, dark tunnel into brilliant sunlight. The legal victory was satisfying, but the deeper triumph was personal. He had stood up for what he believed in and found community support he never knew existed. Thomas pushed through the crowd to reach him, his weathered face split by an enormous grin. "Well done, Your Grace, well done indeed." Mrs. Henderson appeared next, tears streaming down her face as she embraced him with the fierce affection of someone who had watched him struggle back to life. "Those horses will be so happy to see you," she whispered. "They've been restless all morning, like they knew something important was happening, but it was Dr. Collins who moved William most deeply." The physician approached with obvious humility, extending his hand in a gesture that asked for forgiveness. "William, I owe you a profound apology. I let fear override my judgment and nearly cost you everything you've worked to rebuild." William clasped the doctor's hand firmly. "Samuel, you signed that petition because you cared about my welfare. I can't fault you for that, even if I disagreed with your conclusion. But I should have seen what everyone else saw today, that those horses brought you back to life, not closer to madness." The crowd was thinning somewhat, but people continued to approach William with congratulations and support. Jake Harrison, whose cattle William had helped relocate during the drought, clapped him on the shoulder. "About time someone stood up for doing what's right instead of what's convenient," the rancher said. "My offer stands. If you need help with anything for those horses, you just ask." Mrs. Patterson made her way through the remaining well-wishers, her expression showing the satisfaction of someone whose faith had been vindicated. "Margaret would be proud," she said simply. "She always said you had the courage to do difficult things when it mattered." The words hit William with unexpected force. For 3 years, he'd wondered what Margaret would think of his withdrawal, his isolation, his careful preservation of grief. Now he understood that she would have wanted him to choose engagement over safety, love over protection. As the celebration gradually moved outside into the blazing afternoon heat, William found himself in conversation with people who had remained virtual strangers during his years of isolation. The blacksmith's wife shared stories about her own struggles with loss. A young rancher asked advice about drought management. The pastor from Margaret's church spoke about the difference between honoring the dead through preservation versus honoring them through continued growth. "Duke Ashford," came a voice from behind him. William turned to find Mayor Crawley approaching. his political smile noticeably absent. Mr. Mayor, Crawley's expression was carefully controlled, but William could see the frustration and embarrassment beneath the surface. "I want you to know that my concerns about your situation were genuine. Perhaps my methods were questionable, but my motives were—" "Edmund," William interrupted gently, "your motives were mixed at best. But I'm not interested in prolonging this conflict. The matter is settled." The mayor nodded stiffly and walked away, his political aspirations clearly damaged by the day's revelations. Mitchell, William's attorney, approached with the satisfied expression of someone who had won a case that mattered. "Congratulations, Your Grace. Though I have to say, the opposition's case fell apart even faster than I expected." "The truth has a way of revealing itself," William replied, "especially when good people are willing to stand up and speak it." As the crowd continued to disperse, William found himself walking toward his wagon with Thomas, Mrs. Henderson, and Dr. Collins, the people who had stood by him through his darkest period and now shared in his vindication. "What now?" Thomas asked as they prepared for the journey home. William considered the question as he looked back at the courthouse where his competence had been challenged and confirmed. The hearing had been about more than his right to keep horses in his drawing room. It had been about his reintegration into a community he'd thought had forgotten him. "Now we go home to our family," he said, "and tomorrow we begin building something new." The ride back to the estate was conducted in companionable conversation, with each of his companions sharing their observations about the hearing and their relief at its outcome. But William found his thoughts turning toward Grace, hope, and courage, wondering how they had sensed his absence and whether they would detect the change in him when he returned. As they approached the familiar gates of his property, William felt a profound sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with purpose. The horses had arrived as refugees seeking sanctuary, but they had given him something far greater than they had received: a reason to engage with life again, a cause worth fighting for, a family worth protecting. The manor came into view, its stone walls glowing golden in the late afternoon sun. But it was the sight of three familiar figures standing at the open front doors that made William's heart race with joy. Grace stood framed in the doorway like a living statue, her dark coat gleaming with health, her intelligent eyes fixed on his approaching wagon. Hope and courage flanked her on either side, their young bodies radiating the confidence of creatures who knew they were home. "Look at that," Thomas said softly. "They were waiting for you." William felt his throat constrict with emotion as he realized the truth of it. Just as Grace had somehow known to seek sanctuary at his door during her time of desperate need, she had known he would return victorious from his own battle. As the wagon drew to a stop, Grace walked forward to meet him, her gait unhurried but purposeful. When William stepped down from the wagon, she approached and rested her great head against his chest in their familiar gesture of greeting and recognition. "We won," he told her quietly, his hands stroking her neck. "We're going to stay together," Grace nickered softly, a sound that seemed to carry contentment, approval, and something that might have been pride. Hope and courage bounded over with the exuberance of youth, the relief at his return evident in every movement. As William knelt to greet them, he felt a completeness he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Not the same wholeness he'd known with his wife, but a different kind of family contentment built on mutual rescue and unconditional acceptance. "Welcome home," Mrs. Henderson said, as they all walked toward the open doors of the manor. But as William passed through those doors, with Grace beside him and the foals dancing around his feet, he realized that home had never left. It had simply been waiting for him to remember what it meant to choose love over fear, engagement over isolation, hope over despair. The great hall that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of a family reunited. And William Ashford finally understood that some sanctuaries are built not with walls, but with welcome. 6 months after the hearing, William stood in Margaret's restored garden with a new planting trowel in his hands. watching Grace and her foals graze peacefully among the recovering flowers. The autumn air carried the first promise of relief from the long drought, and the desert plants Margaret had so carefully cultivated were beginning to show new growth. The transformation had been gradual but profound. What had begun as 3 desperate animals seeking shelter had evolved into something neither William nor his community could have anticipated. Grace, hope, and courage had become ambassadors of a different way of being, creatures who demonstrated daily that trust and compassion could flourish even in the harshest circumstances. "The delphiniums are coming back," Thomas observed, kneeling beside a patch of emerging blue flowers. "Miss Margaret would be pleased," William nodded, running his fingers through the rich soil. The garden had required careful rehabilitation after years of drought and neglect, but the work had become a meditation on renewal rather than a burden of maintenance. Each new shoot represented possibility, each flower a small victory over the forces of desolation. The changes extended far beyond the garden walls. Word of William's story had spread throughout the territory and beyond, drawing visitors who came to see the horses that lived in a Duke's drawing room and stayed to witness something more profound, a household where different species had created a family based on mutual care and respect. Dr. Morrison had written about the case in a veterinary journal, describing Grace's remarkable intelligence and the therapeutic relationship she'd developed with William. The article had attracted attention from as far away as San Francisco, where a wealthy philanthropist was funding research into animal-human emotional bonds. But the most significant changes were in Esperanza itself. The hearing had forced the community to confront its own assumptions about grief, eccentric behavior, and the obligations neighbors owed to one another. In the months that followed, William noticed a subtle shift toward greater tolerance for unconventional choices and more active support for people struggling with loss. Mrs. Patterson had organized a volunteer network to check on isolated community members. The church had begun a program to match grieving individuals with companion animals from local farms. Even Mayor Crawley, his political ambitions effectively ended by his exposed machinations, had quietly begun volunteering at the territorial orphanage. "Your Grace," Mrs. Henderson called from the manor's entrance. "You have visitors." William looked up to see a familiar figure approaching with a young girl in tow. Sarah Mitchell was a widow who had moved to the territory the previous spring, seeking a fresh start after her husband's death in a mining accident. She had first visited the estate out of curiosity about the famous horses, but had returned repeatedly, drawn by something she found difficult to articulate. "Duke Ashford," Sarah said with a smile that had grown warmer over the months of their acquaintance. "Emma was hoping to spend some time with the Foals before the weather turns." Emma Mitchell was 8 years old, with her late father's red hair and her mother's gentle manner. She had formed an immediate bond with hope and courage, and her presence had brought a dimension to the manor that William hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, the laughter and energy of childhood. "Of course," William said, watching as Emma ran toward the Foals with the fearless affection that only children possessed. They'd been wondering where she was. It was true. Hope and courage had developed the habit of positioning themselves near the front gates on the days Emma usually visited, as if their internal calendars were synchronized with her schedule. Sarah settled onto a garden bench, her expression peaceful as she watched her daughter play. "She's been different since we started coming here," she said quietly. "More confident, less withdrawn. There's something about this place." "It's the acceptance," William said, understanding completely. "They don't judge. They don't require explanations for why we need what we need." Over the months, William and Sarah had shared many conversations about loss, healing, and the unexpected forms that renewal could take. There was no romantic tension between them. Both were still too close to their respective griefs for that, but there was a growing friendship built on mutual understanding and shared experience. "Emma's been asking about staying for supper tonight," Sarah said. "I hope that's not presumptuous." "It would be our pleasure," William replied, meaning it completely. The Manor's dining room had been designed for large gatherings, and it felt right to have it filled with conversation and laughter again. That evening, as they shared a meal prepared by Mrs. Henderson, William marveled at how natural it felt to have voices filling the spaces that had been silent for so long. Emma chatted about her lessons, her plans to help Thomas with the garden preparation for winter, and her theories about what hope and courage might look like when they were fully grown. After dinner, they moved to the great hall, where Grace and her foals had claimed their permanent residence. Emma curled up against Grace's side, while Hope and Courage dozed nearby, creating a scene that perfectly captured the unusual harmony of William's household. "They trust her completely," Sarah observed, watching her daughter stroke Grace's neck. "Children and horses understand each other," William said. "Neither of them complicate affection with conditions." As the evening progressed, William found himself thinking about Margaret's garden journal, still resting on his desk, but now consulted for practical guidance rather than painful remembrance. Her notes about the desert willow had proven prophetic. What looked like fragility was actually profound strength. The ability to bloom when everything else had surrendered. Thomas joined them for coffee, settling into his accustomed chair with the easy manner of someone who had found his rightful place in an unconventional family structure. "Got word from the territorial capital today," he reported. "They're sending a delegation next month to see about establishing some kind of official animal sanctuary program. Seems our situation has attracted attention from people with influence." William considered this development with mixed feelings. Recognition was gratifying, but he was wary of turning Grace's story into something bureaucratic or overly formal. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, seeming to read his hesitation. "I think Grace and her foals saved me as much as I saved them," William replied. "If sharing that experience helps other people find their own forms of healing, then perhaps we have an obligation to be open about it." Later, after Sarah and Emma had departed for their own home and the household had settled into its evening routine, William sat with Grace in the familiar comfort of their nightly ritual. The mare had aged gracefully over the months, her coat showing new thickness in preparation for winter, her bearing reflecting the confidence of a creature who knew herself to be valued and protected. "What do you think, old girl?" William asked, running his hand along her neck. "Ready to help teach other people what you taught me?" Grace's response was to rest her head against his shoulder in their private gesture of communication. In her steady warmth, William found confirmation of what he'd gradually come to understand, that healing was not a destination, but a daily choice to remain open to possibility. The foals had grown significantly, their gangly youth giving way to the elegant lines that marked them as true descendants of the Hartwell bloodline. Hope showed signs of inheriting her mother's intelligence and intuitive understanding of human emotion. Courage displayed the fearless curiosity that would make him an excellent horse for someone seeking a trusted companion. As the house settled into nighttime quiet, William made his way to his study, where Margaret's portrait still hung above the fireplace. But now, instead of a shrine to grief, the room had become a workspace where he planned improvements to the estate, corresponded with other animal welfare advocates, and drafted his thoughts about the relationship between healing and service. The new planting trowel rested on his desk beside Margaret's garden journal, tools for different kinds of cultivation, but equally important to the work of growing life from dormant ground. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities. The territorial delegation would need to be received with appropriate ceremony. The garden required continued attention as it prepared for winter dormancy and spring renewal. Hope and Courage would need additional training as they matured into their adult roles. But tonight, William Ashford sat in his study surrounded by the sounds of a house filled with life, the soft nickering of horses in peaceful rest, the gentle creaking of timber that had learned to accommodate unexpected residents, the whisper of autumn wind through windows that were no longer kept closed against the possibility of intrusion. 3 years ago, grief had made him a stranger to his own life, 6 months ago, 3 desperate animals had arrived at his door and reminded him that sanctuary was something you built with open hands and an open heart. Now, as he prepared to close his books and join his sleeping household, William understood that some gifts come disguised as burdens, some healing looks like disruption, and sometimes the greatest act of love is simply making room for whatever kind of family finds its way to your door.